Welcome everyone to Icon. My name's Dan, and I'm excited that you guys are here with us for the conclusion of our series, Speaking God from Scratch. And what we're doing in the series is we're taking some religious words that we don't really use that much in culture and society very often, and looking back at the meaning of these words and looking at maybe how some of these ideas and how some of these words can still speak to us today. And we're doing that again today. This is our final week in the series. And really where we're going to start is a command that God gave the Hebrew people thousands and thousands of years ago. It was actually kind of the first two commands that he gave them, what we know as the Ten Commandments. This is something that we've probably heard before. And these first two commands is kind of where we're going to focus today. So let me read you the first one from the Hebrew Scriptures in Exodus. It says, "And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Out of the land of slavery, you shall have no other gods before me." So God kind of makes this first command, and he says, hey, in the cultures and the societies in which you live, they worship all these gods. They kind of have a pantheon of gods, but I want you, Israel, to worship me and me alone and have no other gods before me. And then he goes on, and the second command is kind of similar. His second command is this: you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or in earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Basically, God is saying you're not to worship false idols. There are idols that your society has, and that day what there would be is there would be kind of the cultural idols, the gods of that day, and then also many times each family would have kind of their own personal gods, their own small little pantheon of gods in their own home. And he said, I don't want you to fashion any idols. I want you to have these statues that you worship, that you bow down to. I want you to worship me and me alone. You might listen to that and you're going, Dan, that's the direction you're going to go today? It's a bit of a stretch, right? Like, I don't think like idol worship is a real big problem in our culture today. And you might be wondering like, oh man, is he going to like tell me I can't go to my favorite Chinese place because they have a Buddha statue there? Like, I promise I won't put pennies in his lap. I won't even rub his jolly little belly. Can we just leave koi alone, right? Like, let's just take that off the table. That's not the direction I'm going. But today I am going to talk about idols. We're going to talk about idols today. And this is where my mind immediately goes to, and this is probably where your mind immediately goes to. When we talk about idols, we think about these guys, right? Like these little Buddha statues, right? And some of you're thinking several different things. There might be some of you that are like, oh, it's weird. He's got like old little statues up here. Others of you are very nervous right now that I'm going to get struck by lightning, right? You're like, Dan, I don't know if you should have those in church, right? Like this is a house of the Lord, and like we've got these idols up here and, so I don't know what you may be thinking, but what I'm talking about today, these are not the kind of idols I'm talking about today. These might have been kind of the type of idols that Israel struggled with, that they would worship these what they call graven images, but that's not what we're going to talk about. But I believe that idolatry and this kind of idea of having idols in life is prevalent today. You see, I believe that idol worship is just as prevalent in the church today as it was in ancient Israel. Not only do I believe that idol worship is prevalent in the church, I believe that idol worship is prevalent in our culture, in our society. You see, but there's a problem with this kind of idol worship that we're talking about. The problem is that it's easier to see when it's sitting on your hearth as opposed to when it's hiding in your heart. You see, for the ancient people of Israel, it was easy when God said, hey, don't make any idols. Immediately they went, uh-oh. And they knew exactly what to do. The problem for us is it's so ingrained in our culture and our society, and many times we're so blind to it that we never even recognize when those idols find home in our hearts. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking like, Dan, like, I don't even know about this whole God thing. Like, maybe you're a Christian. You're like, hey, that's not a problem for me. Or maybe you're not a Christian. You're like, I don't know about this whole God thing. Like, I believe that even people who are atheists have their own gods that they serve. But to show you this, I want to define for you what I mean when I talk about having this false god or having an idol. Here's how I define it. Anything that becomes the purpose or driving force of your life is your God, small g. Anything that is the animating force of your life, this is why I get up, this is why I live my life, that in a sense is your God. It's a thing that you're living your life on behalf of. You see, I'd argue that really everyone worships. right? Like we all worship. Just as a fish is like made to swim in water and a bird made to fly in the air, we as humans, we are wired for worship. Our brains just work that way. We are wired that our attention can be fixed on one thing and it becomes the purpose for why we live. That to me is how I'm defining this idea of God. So I want to help you define what might be some idols in your life. Some things that maybe have an inordinate amount of focus from you. So to do this, I came across some questions in a book by Kyle Idleman called The Gods at War. And I want to read these questions, and I believe as we look at all of these questions in totality, it'll help point directionally towards there might be an idol in your life. So the first question I have for you is this: what disappoints you? What disappoints you? I want you to think honestly, think for yourself in your life, what is a source of disappointment in your life? Because I believe that when you experience disappointment, what you're experiencing is you had hope in that thing to provide something for you and it fell short. So when you have a disproportionate amount of disappointment in something or in someone, that is evidence that possibly you put too much emphasis on that thing providing something for you to be fulfilled. So what consistently disappoints you? Is it your career? Is it your job? Then maybe your job has taken that place of an idol. Is it a person? Is it a relationship? Is it finances? Are you disappointed by how much you make, or better, how much you don't make, right? And you're consistently disappointed in that thing. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that thing is an idol, but this is a direction arrow. Should be a warning light going, this could possibly be a counterfeit, a false god in your life. Or number two, what do you complain about the most? You see, the first one is more internal, right? It's more something that you experience internally, but this is then when that disappointment works its way on the outside. So this one is probably best to ask someone that knows you best. If you were to go to your spouse or your best friend or someone really close to you, and you were to ask them, what do I complain about the most? My guess is they might have some answers for you. Maybe for you, you complain about your job. Maybe the disrespect that you experience at your job. Maybe for you, what people's opinions of you have taken a place of an idol in your life. So what do you complain about consistently? What disappoints you? What works its way on the outside? What do you complain to your spouse about the most? Maybe they've become an idol. Maybe you complain that you don't get enough time for yourself and your hobbies, and you want time for you. And maybe you complain about your sex life. Maybe you complain about something and it's consistent. Maybe for you, you have become the idol. And gratifying yourself and your own needs have gone to that place of primacy for you. So what do you complain about the most? Or third, how about this? Where do you make financial sacrifices? You see, this is huge because in any worship of any God, there's always sacrifices that are made. So what are you sacrificing for? If you did this, if you took your bank statement or your credit card statement and you pretended like it was a complete stranger and the only information you had for this person but what was on their bank statement, what would you discover as you looked it over? What are the things that they purchase consistently? What are the things that they invest into? What are the things that they buy? What are the things that they give to? What are the things that they make sacrifices for? At what point do they decide, hey, we don't have money here in the bank account, but there's this really nice card that lets me buy anything I want up to a limit? What are the things that land on that? What are those things that you make financial sacrifices for? Again, this is a directional arrow saying that this thing has become a kind of idol potentially in your life. Or how about this one? Where is your sanctuary? Let me define this because this is another kind of like weird religious word. Here's what I mean by that. God said, I am your refuge in time of trouble. I am your strong tower. God is saying, like, I will be a place of sanctuary. I will be a place when you have the worst day of your life, you can come to me and find fulfillment. So let me ask you, when you have a terrible day at work, when you have a hard day, when you're frustrated, when you're angry at your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your spouse, when you're frustrated, where do you go for sanctuary? There's some people that go to the fridge and worship at the altar of Ben & Jerry's with some Chunky Monkey or Cherry Garcia, and you say, yes, Lord, and you eat your emotions, right? Where is that sanctuary for you? Maybe for you, you're frustrated, you're annoyed, you have a tough day at work, and you can't wait home to get to home, to crack open a cold one, and to sit in front of Netflix and just veg out. Is that your sanctuary? Maybe it's somebody that you're so frustrated you have to text them, you won't believe what my boss said, you won't believe what the professor did, you won't believe what this person did, and you constantly go to other people as a source of sanctuary. Again, all of these directional arrows pointing to what could be an idol in your life. Or how about this? What infuriates you, right? Because we all have these hot button issues, right? That if somebody says something about that, it just sets you off. I've discovered a good place to discover the answer to this question is something called social media, right? It's amazing. You can find so much out about someone by checking that out. And why is it that text on a screen can set us off like nothing else? You know what I've discovered over these past few years? I feel like political passion has increased, and not the good kind, over the past few years, right? Our political ideologies separate us and divide us more than anything else. And I've found, I think for many people, politics has become an idol for them. I think there's a lot of people that worship elephants and donkeys in our nation. Our political ideology becomes idolatry in our lives. I love what a pastor and theologian in New York said about this, kind of punching on both sides, and here's what he said. When love of one's own people becomes absolute, it turns into racism. When love of equality turns into a supreme thing, it can result in hatred and violence toward anyone who has led a privileged life. It is the settled tendency of human societies to turn good political causes into counterfeit gods. We can look upon our political leaders as messiahs, our political policies as saving doctrine, and turn our political activism into a kind of religion. Ouch. Right? And we've seen this. We've seen this. If we just get my person in that spot, then our world will be better. If we can have the Messiah just stay in this place of power, if we can get our person there, then we win, and it becomes this idolatry. What are the things that infuriate you, that set you off? But it's not always bad things. Sometimes it's even good things. What are your dreams? What do you dream about? If it's been said that our nightmares can tell us something about ourselves, I would argue that our daydreams communicate much more. So what is it that you find yourself daydreaming about? What do you find yourself fantasizing about? That job, that career, that money? What is it, that relationship? There are tons of different things that can fill this place of dreams. When you wake up in the morning, what are you excited about? Is that thing becoming a false god in your life? You see, all of these questions are just direction arrows that should be pointing in one way or another. So I want you to honestly ask yourself these questions. You see, this is pointing at what could be a counterfeit god in your life. See, and I'd argue that it's not always bad things. Sometimes it can even be good things. In fact, anything can serve as an idol, especially the very best things in life. You see, many times things are amoral. They're neither bad nor good. It's what we do with those things. And many times the best gifts in life can become idols. Something that is a gift from life that's amazing, it's awesome, you should enjoy it, but it should not get that place of primacy in your life. You see, as followers of God, for me, I look at it as God is the source of all. He is the creator and the beginning of all things, and every good gift comes from God. And what happens many times is what happens in many of our families, right? Like for those of you with kids, you've seen this, or maybe when you were a child, you remember this, but you give your child a gift and you want them to enjoy it, right? Maybe you get them a game system, or you get them a phone, or you chip in, you work with them, and they get a car, and you want them to enjoy that thing, right? And then, even though you were the one that gave them that thing, all of a sudden they start spending all their time with that thing, not the giver of that thing. And when you realize, it seems as though that good gift that you gave them is now more important than you and your relationship, the person who gave it to them. Or when we see this in our kids, right? If you have littler kids, or you've seen this in little kids, and they're so excited that grandma and grandpa are coming. They're so thrilled, they can't wait to see grandma and grandpa, because when grandma and grandpa come, they bring presents, right? And all of a sudden, it's like presents are coming, and you're like, no, grandma and grandpa are coming, right? And when they get too excited for the things, you need to step in and correct that, right? I think many times it's that way with us too. That we do that very same thing with God, that he gives us a good gift to enjoy, and all of a sudden that thing becomes an idol in our life. Something that we will sacrifice for when we quit sacrificing for God. See, the author of the letter to the church in Rome put it this way. He said this: they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. You see, when I talk about worship, when I talk about this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. For some people, you grew up in church, so some of these ideas, some of these words are very common to you. Hearing the idea of worship, that's nothing strange to you. But some of you that you don't have a church background, when you come in and we stand on the stage and we say, hey, let's worship together, and you're like, let's what? And then we sing songs about like the blood of the lamb, and you're like, time out, hold on, I did not sign up for that, right? It's like the blood of Jesus covers you. And I'm like, nope, I'm out. Officially, I am done, right? And we hear these things, and sometimes we don't even understand what we're talking about. And what I mean by worship, I want to define this for you. When I say everyone worships, here's how I define worship. Worship is nothing more than attention and pursuit. That's worship. So at the beginning of the service, at the end of the service, when we take time to slow down, to let go of all the distraction, and we put our attention on God, and we allow our minds and our hearts and our attitudes to pursue God, that's worship. So that can happen when we sing songs, and that can happen when we go outside those doors. Where is your attention? Where is your pursuit moving in? And sometimes things can become idols in our lives, but it's not just things. Sometimes it's people. Sometimes it's relationships. Sometimes it's the idea of relationships. I've seen this a lot, especially, unfortunately, in the church, that the church, it's almost as if the church raises up the idea of marriage as like the penultimate thing of Christian living. And let me just tell you, if you're single in this room, you don't need someone next to you to make you someone. You don't need to pursue some marriage or some relationship so you can have it all. No, you are fine just as you are, and you can follow and serve God just as you are and pursue your dreams and passions. You don't need that to be someone. But so often, we lift up people and things and ideas of things, and they become idols in our life. You see, and what can happen is it can happen here in the church, where we come in on Sunday morning and we sing our songs and we worship God in this way, and then we go out there and we worship all the other gods, lowercase g, that are in our lives. It happened in ancient Israel in ancient ways, and I believe it happens in modern America in very modern ways. The Hebrew scriptures put it this way, communicating this idea. They worship the Lord, but they also serve their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. As if these people of God said, yeah, we'll worship God, but we're also going to take our like household gods with us too, right? Like we can do that, right? We can worship God here, but we don't want to give up these things because everyone's doing this. Like everyone worships these gods. I'm not going to be some weirdo in my culture and my society, and we do the very same thing, don't we? We come in here and we worship God, and culture and society talk about careers and jobs and relationships and money, and we got to have the new car and the right house and all of these things. And then our attention, our dreams go this way, our finances go this way, and these things become an idol in our lives. And I would argue that even religion itself can become an idol. When we seek these ideas about God over the person of God, Tim Keller in his book Counterfeit Gods took this idea as he talked about how religion becomes an idol. He talks about it in this way. He says, idolatry functions widely inside religious communities when doctrinal truth is elevated to the position of a false god. This occurs when people rely on the rightness of their doctrine for their standing with God rather than God himself and his grace. He goes on to say this. It is a subtle but deadly mistake making an idol out of doctrinal accuracy. It leads to arrogance and self-righteousness and oppression of those whose views differ. And in this way, we can even lift up religion itself as a false god. So here's the thing, if we just talk about idolatry and talk about it from an idea level and it never lands in our practical lives, we've fallen short. I want to help you learn how to root these things out. I mean, the question begging to be asked is, how do you crush your idols? right? Like, how do you get rid of those things? If you acknowledge they're there, how do you get rid of them? And for this, I'm going to look to the Hebrew scriptures again, where this command kind of comes from, at the life of a man named Abram. Abram was a man that he grew up in his father's household, and they had their kind of household gods. And God speaks to Abram, and he says, I want you to come out from your family, come out from everything you know, come out from your household gods, and I want you to worship and follow me. I want you to travel to a land you have not been. And that, not just literal, metaphorical. I want you to travel out from your culture and leave behind you all these false gods. And it's in this small little passage in Genesis 12. But what I love is there's this practice called midrash in Jewish interpretation. Midrash simply means asking or seeking. And what Jewish theologians, what these Hebrew, many times these rabbis would do is they would take a story from their scriptures and then they would elaborate on it. They might add some backstory or add kind of what they meant. And this just means midrash, and it adds layers to the story. And there's this beautiful midrash about this story with Abram leaving his family's household. And it goes like this, that Abram was the son of a man named Terah. And Terah one time had to leave for a day's journey, and he leaves and puts Abram in charge. Abram's been told by God that he needs to leave his family's household, leave all of his family gods, and worship the one true God alone. So while his father Terah is gone, Abram goes to the household altar, and he destroys all the altars. And he breaks every single one. He smashes them in his house. And then he leaves a club right next to the one largest idol there in the middle. His father Terah comes in from a long day's journey, and he sees what's happened. He looks around. He says, Abram, what's happened? Who has hated our family so much that they would come in, they would destroy our home, that they would destroy our altar and destroy all of our gods? Who would do this? And Abram says, I'm so sorry. I hoped to make it in time, but I came in and I saw that obviously the largest God with the club, surely he was angry that he was not receiving all of the worship, and he crushed all of the smaller idols himself. I'm sorry, it was him. Terah was furious. And he flew off the handle and he said, son, do you think I'm a fool? These things are just stones. Stone cannot crush other stones. Who do you think I am? And Abram replied, he said, you know they're powerless, and yet you worship them. And in our lives as well, we know they're powerless, don't we? We know that more money will not equal more happiness. In fact, the great modern theologian put it this way, mo money, mo problems, right? Like, we know that doesn't fix it. We know that doesn't solve any problems. We can see the most successful people we know, and they still feel empty on the inside. It was Jim Carrey that said, I wish everyone had a chance to have all the wealth in the world so that they could find out that it doesn't do anything for you. See, we have these idols, and we think they're going to fulfill us. We think the right job or the right person, the right relationship, the right amount of money, and then we'll be set. And we keep chasing after these false idols that have no power and leave us empty every time. We've got to do what Abraham did and realize these things are powerless. So why do we serve them? So I'm going to draw 3 ideas from the story of Abram. These are kind of 3 ways to destroy our idols. Number 1, you have to identify the idols. Like, first, we have to know what they are, right? And this is the purpose of kind of asking these questions, helping us identify what things in our life may have elevated themselves to a place of a false god in our lives. What are the things that we think about constantly, that we complain about, that infuriate us, that we dream about? What are those things? We identify the idols first. For Abram, it was easy. He could look across his mantle, across the hearth. For us, we have to look inside of our hearts. And then number 2, the second thing Abram did is he had to acknowledge the powerlessness of those idols. He came to this realization, and we must come to that same realization, that we realize these things are powerless. They're not going to fulfill us. They're going to leave us empty. But then there's this last truth that we must know, that we've got to wrap our heads around. And it's this, that you don't remove gods, you replace them. Remember, we're wired for worship. We're wired in such a way that our attention just moves in a direction. That there's always some passion rumbling within us. So if you're wired for worship, you can't just remove the idols. You can't remove the gods. You must replace the God. And just like Abram, who left the gods of his household and followed the one true God, we must do the same. And here's the thing. You might be in this room and maybe you're a follower of Jesus. And you're like me, just sometimes your focus shifts. And sometimes your heart just strays. And what you need is a realignment. You need to acknowledge, yes, there's some idols in my life. I know they're powerless. And I'm going to put God in that place. I'm putting Jesus in that seat. But maybe you're in this room and you're unsure about this Jesus thing. You're unsure about God and you don't know what to think about that. I'm not here to try to twist anyone's arm. I'm not here to try to use logic or to convince you to do something. All I can tell you is what I've experienced. What I've experienced. So I understand the person of Jesus is something that gives you true fulfillment. See, it was Jesus that said, I have come to give you life and life to the fullest. He said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. See, what I've experienced in the person of Jesus is something that transforms your life. I believe that it will make your world better while it makes the whole world better. This way of living can change everything. See, Jesus' followers, they wrestled with this idea. They weren't sure Jesus was who he claimed to be. They didn't know, and there was this kind of esoteric idea they had about God, but is Jesus really who he says he is? In the Gospel of John, we read about these disciples kind of asking these questions, and Jesus, in the clearest way ever, declares who he is. He says this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If you know me, you will know my Father. You will see God when you see me. If you've seen me, then you've already seen God. I am in God, and God is in me. When I speak, it is God speaking. When I work, you see God working. So when I wonder about the character and the nature of God, I get to look at the life of Jesus. When I wonder what the words of Jesus would be as he speaks into a situation, I look at the words of Jesus. You see, in what I see, in Jesus, the Christ, the Redeemer of all things, is creator becoming creation. God taking on flesh and blood and moving into the neighborhood, to stepping into our world, to taking the worst the world could throw at him, to take on the sin of the world and to recycle it into forgiveness, and to look while hanging on a tree and say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I want to follow that. When I see the resurrected Jesus, as he gathers up his disciples, and he says, you want to know what the big deal is? You want to know, I've got a brand new command. When Jesus is summing up his life and his ministry and giving us a new way of living and operating in our world, he says, go and love each other as I have loved you. You saw me hanging on that cross, forgiving those who were killing me. Go love people like that. You see, John, he was one of Jesus' probably closest disciples, the one who wrote that gospel, recording what Jesus said about who he was. In a letter that he wrote, he put it this simply: God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. So when you're thinking about replacing that God in your life, I would challenge you to replace it with the person of Jesus, the one who showed us this way of love. And if you're in this room and you haven't done that, I want to challenge you today. Would you make that decision? You don't have to say some magical words. You don't need some priest or some pastor to come walk you through it. All you have to do is make this decision that, you know what? I know I've got these false counterfeit gods in my life. I know there's idols in my life. I know I worship. My heart moves in a direction, sure. And I want to do my best to move that worship, to move that attention to Jesus. I want to do my best to live in the way of Jesus, to live like that. Here's what we're going to do in a moment. Band is going to sing a couple of songs, and we're just going to take some moment to sing together. And I want to challenge you, if that's you, to take some time to process this. for all of us, may we think through those questions and wrestle with what are the things that are idols in our life. And let's acknowledge this hasn't done anything for us. It's not going to do anything for us. And may we take those idols out of our hearts and put Jesus in his rightful spot. And all I can tell you is for me, it has changed my life. It is the animating purpose and force of my life. And I know so many people that are just like that. And I believe it makes our world better while it makes the whole world better. Don't get me wrong. We fail all the time. I'll be first in line to say, I fail all the time. I sin. There are idols in my life that creep back in. May we, like Abram, be people, tear down the idols, put God in his rightful spot. Amen? Let's pray.